The Urantia book, section 3, the history of Urantia, paper 94, the Melchizedek teachings in the Orient. The early teachers of the Salem religion penetrated to the remotest tribes of Africa and Eurasia, ever preaching Machiventa's gospel of man's faith and trust in the one universal God as the only price of obtaining divine favor. Melchizedek's covenant with Abraham was the pattern for all the early propaganda that went out from Salem and other centers. Urantia has never had more enthusiastic and aggressive missionaries of any religion than these noble men and women who carried the teachings of Melchizedek over the entire Eastern Hemisphere. Indeed, because the apostles, the later apostles, actually you could say that these missionaries were the first apostles. The later apostles were also not really into going out into the world, and they were oftentimes pushed to do so in the sense, you know, because then when things happened they got very disturbed by it, and yeah, these apostles of Jesus were actually 12 men who were easily manipulated by their animal human emotions. These missionaries were recruited from many peoples and races, and they largely spread their teachings through the medium of native converts. They established training centers in different parts of the world where they taught the natives the Salem religion, and then commissioned these pupils to function as teachers among their own people. So the Salem teachings in Vedic India. In the days of Melchizedek, India was a cosmopolitan country which had recently come under the political and religious dominance of the Aryan-Endite invaders from the north and west. At this time, only the northern and western portions of the peninsula had been extensively permeated by the Aryans. These Vedic newcomers had brought along with them their many tribal deities. Their religious forms of worship followed closely the ceremonial practices of their earlier Endite forebears, forefathers, in that the father still functioned as a priest and the mother as a priestess, and the family hearth was still utilized as an altar. The Vedic cult was then in process of growth and metamorphosis under the direction of Brahman caste of teacher priests. And Brahman castes means the Sethites. The Sethites were also in India named as Brahman, who were gradually assuming control over the expanding ritual of worship, the amalgamation of the one-time 33 Aryan deities was well underway when the Salem missionaries penetrated the north of India. The polytheism of the Aryans represented a degeneration of their earlier monotheism occasioned by their separation into tribal units, each tribe having its venerated so-called god. This devolution of the original monotheism and Trinitarianism of Endite Mesopotamia was in process of resynthesis in the early centuries of the second millennium before Christ. While the many so-called gods were organized into a pantheon under the triunion, so-called triunion leadership, so-called leadership of Dyaus, Pitar, the Lord of Heaven, Indra, the tempestuous Lord of the so-called atmosphere, and Agni, the so-called Lord of the three-headed fire god, the so-called Lord of the earth, and the so-called vestigial symbol of an earlier so-called Trinity concept. And I deliberately say so-called. Definite henotheistic developments were paving the way for an evolved monotheism. The so-called Agni, the most so-called ancient deity, was often so-called exalted as the so-called fatherhead of the entire pantheon. The rejection of the Melchizedek gospel of trusting God and salvation through faith marked a vital turning point for India. The Salem missionaries had contributed much to the loss of faith in all the ancient Vedic so-called gods. But the so-called leaders, the priests of Vedism, refused to accept the Melchizedek teaching of one God and one simple faith. So the Brahmins, the Sethites, cult the sacred writings of their day in an effort to combat the Salem teachers. And this compilation, as later revised, has come on down to modern times as the Rig Veda, one of the most ancient of sacred books. The second, third, and fourth Vedas followed as the Brahmins sought to crystallize, formalize, fix their rituals of worship and sacrifice upon the peoples of those days. Taken at their best, these writings are the equal of any other body of similar character in beauty of concept and truth of discernment, but as this superior religion became contaminated with the thousands upon thousands of superstitions, cults, and rituals and ceremonies of southern India, it progressively metamorphosed into the most variegated system of theology ever developed by mortal man. An examination of the Vedas will disclose some of the highest and some of the most debased concepts of deity ever to be conceived. Then we have Brahmanism, that's number 2. As the Salem missionaries penetrated southward in the Dravidian Deccan, and Deccan is a part in India, an area in India, they encountered an increasing caste system, the scheme of the Aryans to prevent a loss of racial identity in the face of a rising tide. Of the secondary Samgik peoples. Secondary Samgik peoples are the green, blue, and indigo Samgik races. The primary are the red, yellow, and orange Samgik races. And now, with the weakening of Vedism, through the rejection of higher truth, the cult of the Aryans became subject to increasing inroads from the Deccan. In a desperate effort to stem the tide of racial extinction and religious obliteration, the Brahmin caste, which is the Sethite priests, caste sought to exalt themselves above all else. They taught that the sacrifice to deity in itself was all efficacious, that it was all compelling in its potency. Well, and they started to proclaim that of the two essential divine principles of the universe, one was Brahman, the deity, better known as the Paradise Father, and the other was the Brahman priesthood. Among no other Urantia peoples did the priests presume to exalt themselves above even their so-called gods, to relegate to themselves the honors due their so-called gods. But they went so absurdly far with these presumptions and presumptuous claims that the whole precarious system collapsed before the debasing cults which poured in from the surrounding and less advanced civilizations. Okay. Of all the contaminating beliefs which could have become fastened upon what may have been an emerging monotheism, none was stultifying as this belief in transmigration. The doctrine of reincarnation of souls, which came from the Dravidian Deccan, so from India, from a region in India known as Deccan. This belief in the weary and monotonous round of repeated transmigrations robbed struggling mortals of their long-cherished hope of finding that deliverance and spiritual advancement in death, which had been a part of the earlier Vedic faith. This philosophically debilitating teaching was soon followed by the invention of the doctrine of the eternal escape from self by submergence in the universal rest and peace of absolute union with Brahman, the oversoul of all creation. Mortal desire and human ambition were effectually ravished and virtually destroyed. Brahmanic philosophy, point 3. While the highest phase of Brahmanism was hardly a religion, it was truly one of the most noble reaches of the mortal mind into the domains of philosophy and metaphysics. Having started out to discover reality, the Indian mind did not stop until it had speculated about almost every phase of theology, accepting the essential dual concept of religion. The existence of the universal Father of all universe creatures and the fact of the ascending experience in the universe of these very creatures as they seek to attain the eternal Father, who has commanded them to be perfect even as he is perfect. And then the last of this piece. In the concept of Brahman, the minds of those days truly grasped at the idea of some all-pervading absolute, for this postulate was at one and the same time of all one and the same time identified as creative energy and cosmic reaction, Brahman was conceived to be beyond all definition. Well, that is what God is. He's all names and no names at the same time. He's everything and no thing at the same time. Capable of being comprehended only by the successive negation of all finite qualities. It was definitely a belief in an absolute, even an infinite being, but this concept was largely devoid of personality attributes and was therefore not experienceable by individual religionists. Brahman-Narayana was conceived as the absolute, the infinite it is. The primordial creative potency of the potential cosmos, the universal self-existing, static and potential throughout all eternity. Had the philosophers of those days been able to make the next advance in deity conception, had they been able to conceive of the Brahman as associative and creative, as a personality approachable by created and evolving beings, then might such a teaching have become the most advanced portraiture of deity on Urantia, since it would have encompassed the first 5 levels of total deity function and might possibly have envisioned the remaining 2. In certain phases, the concept of the one universal oversoul as the totality of the summation of all creature existence led the Indian philosophers very close to the truth of the Supreme Being, but this truth availed them not because they failed to evolve any reasonable or rational personal approach to the attainment of their theoretic monotheistic goal of Brahman-Narayana. Now then we have the karma principle of causality. Continuity is again very close to the truth of repercussional synthesis of all time-space actions in the deity presence of the Supreme, but this postulate never provided for the coordinate personal attainment of deity by the individual religionist, for the ultimate engulfment of all personality by the universal oversoul. The philosophy of Brahmanism also came very near to the realization of the indwelling of the thought adjusters, only to become perverted through the misconception of truth. The teaching that the soul is the indwelling of the Brahman would have paved the way for an advanced religion had not this concept been completely vitiated by the belief that there is no human individuality apart from this indwelling of the universal one. In the doctrine of merging of the self-soul with the oversoul, the theologians of India fail to provide for the survival of something human, something new and unique, something born of the union of the will of Father and the will of God. The teaching of the soul's return to the Brahman is closely parallel to the truth of the adjuster's return to the bosom of the universal Father, but there is something distinct from the adjuster which also survives the morontial counterpart of mortal personality, and this vital concept was fatally absent from the Brahmanic philosophy. Well, Brahmanic philosophy has approximated many of the facts of the universe and has and has, approached numerous cosmic truths, but it has all too often fallen victim to the error of failing to differentiate between the several levels of reality. What may be finite illusory on the absolute level may be absolutely real on the finite level, and it has also taken no cognizance of the essential personality of the universal Father, who is personally contactable on all levels, from the evolutionary creature's limited experience with God on up to the limitless experience of the eternal Son with the Paradise Father. 4. The Hindu religion. Let me see how many. Oh my gosh. Well, the Hindu religion, we see the same things back. With the passing of the centuries in India, the populace returned in measure to the ancient rituals of the Vedas, as they had been modified by the teachings of the Melchizedek missionaries and crystallized by the later Brahmin priesthood, which is the Sethite priesthood. This, the oldest and most cosmopolitan of the world's religions, has undergone further changes in response to Buddhism and Jainism and to the later appearing influences of Mohammedanism and this so-called Christianity. But by the time the teachings of Jesus arrived, they had already become so occidentalized as to be a white man's religion, hence strange and foreign to the Hindu mind. Hindu theology at present depicts 4 descending levels of deity and divinity. One is the Brahman, the Absolute, the Infinite One, the It Is. 2, the Trimurti, the Supreme Trinity of Hinduism, and in this association, Brahma, the first member, is conceived as being self-created out of the Brahman - infinity. Then we have number 3, Vedic and post-Vedic deities. Many of the ancient so-called gods of the Aryans have persisted as secondary to the 3 members of the Trimurti. The names were... So the Vedic and post-Vedic deities, such so-called gods as Agni, Indra and Soma, have persisted as secondary to the 3 members of the Trimurti. Numerous additional so-called gods have arisen since the early days of Vedic India, and these have also been incorporated into the Hindu pantheon. Then we have point 4, the so-called demigods, the so-called Superman, the so-called semi-gods, the so-called heroes, the demons, the ghosts, the evil spirits, the sprites, the monsters, the goblins, and the saints of the later day cults. While Hinduism has long failed to vivify the Indian people, at the same time it has usually been a tolerant religion. Its great strength lies in the fact that it has proved to be the most adaptive amorphic religion to appear on Urantia. It is capable of almost unlimited change and possesses an unusual range of flexible adjustment from the high and semi-monotheistic speculations of the intellectual Brahman Sethite to the errant fetishism and primitive cult practices of the debased and depressed classes of ignorant believers. Well, today in India, the great need is for the portrayal of a Jesusonian gospel, or Jesusonian gospel, dash the fatherhood of God and the sonship and a consequent brotherhood of all men, which is personally realized in loving ministry and social service. In India, the philosophical framework is existent, the cult structure is present. All that is needed is the vitalizing spark of the dynamic love portrayed to the original gospel of the Son of Man, divested of the Occidental dogmas and doctrines which have tended to make Michael's life bestowal a white man's religion. Point 5, the struggle for truth in India. This struggle was in actuality based on three streams. It was in direct consequence of teachings that the earliest form of Taoism arose in China. A vastly different religion than the one which bears that name today. So this means that not all the things that is known as Taoism is really Taoism. You need to use your sifting, your sieve to sift out the things that are untrue. So there's a lot of things called Taoism, but it's not really Taoism at all. All right. Throughout all the mains. Okay. So then the one which bears that name today. Early or proto-Taoism was compound of the following factors. 1. The lingering teachings of Singlangton, which persisted in the concept of Shangti, the so-called God of Heaven, or better said, the God of Heaven. In the times of Singlangton, the Chinese people became virtually monotheistic. They concentrated their worship on the one truth. Later known as the Spirit of Heaven, the universe ruler, and the yellow races never fully lost this early concept of deity, although in subsequent centuries many subordinate so-called gods and spirits insidiously crept into their religion. 2. The Salem religion of a Most High Creator deity who would bestow his favor upon mankind in response to man's faith. 3. The Brahman absolute concept of the Indian philosophers, coupled with the desire to escape all evil. Perhaps the greatest extraneous influence in the eastward spread of the Salem religion was exerted by the Indian teachers of the Vedic faith, who injected their conception of the Brahman the absolute into the salvationistic thought of the Salemites. This composite belief spread through the lands of the yellow and brown races as an underlying influence in religio-philosophic thought. In Japan, this proto-Taoism was known as Shinto, and in this country, far distant from Salem, of Palestine, the peoples learned of the incarnation of Machiventa, Melchizedek, who dwelt upon earth, that the name of God might not be forgotten by mankind. In China, all of these beliefs were later confused and compounded with the ever-growing cult of ancestor worship. But never since the time of Singleton have the Chinese fallen into the helpless slavery to priestcraft. The yellow race was the first to emerge from barbaric bondage into orderly civilization because it was the first to achieve some measure of freedom from the abject fear of the gods, not even fear of the so-called gods, not even fearing the ghosts of the dead as other races feared them. Okay, but the Selemites did not labor in vain. It was upon the foundations of their gospel that the great philosophers of the so-called 6th century China built their teachings. The moral atmosphere and the spiritual sentiments of the times of Lao Tzu and Confucius grew up out of the teachings of the Salem missionaries of an earlier age. Lao Tzu and Confucius, that's point 6. Lao Tzu built directly upon the concepts of the Salem traditions when he declared Tao to be the one first cause of all creation. Lao was a man of great spiritual vision. He taught that man's eternal destiny was everlasting union with Tao, supreme God and universal King. His comprehension of ultimate causation was most discerning, for he wrote, "Unity arises out of the absolute Tao, and from unity there appears cosmic duality, and from such duality Trinity springs forth into existence, and Trinity is the primal source of all reality. All reality is ever in balance between the potentials and the actuals of the cosmos, and these are eternally harmonized by the spirit of divinity." Lao Tzu also made one of the earliest presentations of the doctrine of returning good for evil. Goodness begets goodness, but to the one who is truly good, evil also begets goodness. He was also the one that taught the return of the creature to the Creator and pictured life as the emergence of personality from the cosmic potentials, while death was like the returning home of the creature personality. Lao's concept of true faith was unusual, and he too likened it to the attitude of a little child. His understanding of the eternal purpose of God was clear, for he said the absolute deity does not strive but is always victorious. He does not coerce mankind but always stands ready to respond to their true desires. The will of God is eternal in patience and eternal in the inevitability of its expression. And of the true religionist, he said in expressing the truth that it is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, Lao's teaching of non-resistance and the distinction which he made between action and coercion became later perverted into the belief into the belief of seeing, doing, and thinking. Nothing. But Lao never taught such error, albeit his presentation of non-resistance has been a factor in the further development of the pacific predilections of the Chinese peoples. Lao also taught that faith in the absolute God is the source of that divine energy which will remake the world, and by which man ascends to spiritual union with Tao, the eternal deity and creator absolute of the universes. Now we go to Confucius. And this guy was a younger contemporary of Lao in the 6th century China. Confucius based his doctrines upon the better moral traditions of the long history of the yellow race. Confucius set a new pace for the shamans in that he put morality in the place of magic, but he built too well. He made a new fetish out of order and established a respect for ancestral conduct that is still venerated by the Chinese at the time of this writing. So the Confucian preachment of morality was predicated on the theory that the earthly way is the distorted shadow of the heavenly way, that the true pattern of temporal civilization is the mirror reflection of the eternal order of heaven. The potential God concept in Confucianism was almost completely subordinated to the emphasis placed upon the way of heaven, the pattern of the cosmos. The teachings of Lao have been lost to all but a few in the Orient, but the writings of Confucius have ever since constituted the basis of the moral fabric of the culture of almost a third of Urantians. These Confucian precepts, while perpetuating the best of the past, was somewhat inimical to the very Chinese spirit of investigation that had produced those achievements which were so venerated. The influence of these doctrines were unsuccessfully combated both by the imperial efforts of Shi Huangti and by the teachings of Moti, who proclaimed a brotherhood founded not on ethical duty but on the love of God. He sought to rekindle the ancient quest for new truth, but his teachings failed before the vigorous opposition of the disciples of Confucius. Like many other spiritual moral teachers, both Confucius and Lao Tzu were eventually deified by their followers in those spiritually dark ages of China. Then we go to point 7, Gautama Siddhartha. Seven, 8, and 9 are all about Buddhism. 10 also, 11 and 12 Okay, it's now 39 minutes, so I'm taking a bit more speed here. So Gautama Siddhartha, contemporary with Lao Tzu and Confucius in China, another great teacher of truth arose in India, which is Gautama Siddhartha. And he was born in the 6th century before Christ in the North Indian province of Nepal. His followers later made it appear that he was the son of a fabulously wealthy ruler, but as a matter of fact, in truth, he was nothing more than the heir apparent to the throne of a petty chieftain who ruled by sufferance over a small and secluded mountain valley in the southern Himalayas. I have seen a movie in which this is being stated, so probably that the one who produced that movie was more in the truth, in the knowing. Gautama formulated those theories which grew into the philosophy of Buddhism. After 6 years of the futile practice of yoga, and it's so funny that they are saying futile practice of yoga, so that says quite a lot about yoga. I think to be very honest, yoga is nothing more than a torture way of your body. People who practice yoga are not aware of the fact that they are actually doing a tremendous amount of torturing of their body, which is not what God wants us to do. God never told us to torture our bodies. God never told us to torture our bodies with things such as yoga, fasting, and whatever. This fasting, people, is also a torture of your soul as well as a torture of your body. This is very clearly stated also by Jesus himself. Jesus himself never did any fasting. So that what is stated in the Bible is completely nonsense, that he did 40 days and nights of fasting, because he never did. He, in his whole life, he forgot twice to eat. And that was 2 times he forgot to eat, and in these times it was because he was in such a deep connection with the Paradise Father that he truly forgot to eat. When he was 40 days on the Mount Hermon, he had a person with him, and this young boy made it possible that Jesus had every week fresh food, or I think every 2 days or 3 days fresh food, and this young boy brought it to a certain point, and on the route to the Mount Hermon, and there was then at a certain point a sort of cave, and that's where this young boy placed fresh food for Jesus, and so then Jesus could eat fresh food. So he just ate. And another thing, many people think that, and I don't know where they get all this information from, but many people think that Jesus was a Nazarene. He was not. Jesus never participated in any group or political formation or cultural ideas or whatever. He never participated in anything that had to that had to do with a human oriented and based ideas and creation of such systems. Siddhartha made a determined but unavailing fight against the growing caste system. There was a lofty sincerity and a unique unselfishness about this young prophet prince that greatly appealed to the men of those days. He detracted from the practice of seeking individual salvation through physical affliction and personal pain, and that is exactly what yoga and fasting and all these practices that have been promoted through the New Age and through this Judaism. These are nothing more than physical and actual also soul afflictions and pains. And he exhorted his followers to carry his gospel to the world. Amid the confusion and extreme cult practices of India, the saner and more moderate teachings of Gautama came as a refreshing relief. I want to say that the Buddhist teachings of today that you are reading are not the Buddhist teachings anymore as were being taught by Gautama Siddhartha himself. In that time, things went oral. A lot of things have been distorted during the ages, and most originality has been taken out. So also for the Buddhist teachings counts, you need to go through it with a sieve and then sift out all the distortions and untruths, and then you will find the higher spiritual truths in these teachings. He denounced gods, priests, and their sacrifices, but he too failed to perceive the personality of the one universal. Not believing in the existence of individual human souls, Gautama, of course, made a valiant fight against the time-honored belief in transmigration of the soul. He made a noble effort to deliver men from fear, to make them feel at ease and at home in the great universe, but he failed to show them the pathway to the real and supernal home of ascending mortals. Which is paradise. Gautama was a real prophet, and had he heeded the instruction of the hermit Godat, he might have aroused all India by the inspiration of the revival of the Salem gospel of salvation by faith. Godat was descendant through a family that had never lost the traditions of the Melchizedek missionaries. At Benares, Gautama founded his school, and it was during its second year that a pupil, Botan, imparted to his teacher the traditions of the Salem missionaries about the Melchizedek covenant with Abraham. And while Siddhartha did not have a very clear concept of the universal Father, he took an advanced stand on salvation through faith, simple belief. He so declared himself before his followers. and began sending his students out in groups of 60 to proclaim to the people of India the glad tidings of free salvation, that all men high and low can attain bliss by faith in righteousness and justice. Gautama's wife believed her husband's gospel and was the founder of an order of nuns. His son became his successor and greatly extended the cult he grasped. The new idea of salvation through faith, but in his later years wavered regarding the Salem gospel of divine favor through faith alone, and in his old age his dying words were, "Work out your own salvation." So now we get to see and understand that this whole sentence that is also being placed in the Bible is not coming from God, but directly coming from Gautama Siddhartha, his son in actuality. So now you get to see that the Bible is truly a man-created, a man-written, and by man self-declared holy book. There is nothing godly in it. It's not a book of God, absolutely not. You can read here, you can read in the entire Old Testament a lot of streamings: Buddhism, Hinduism, Stoicism, Mithraism, Sinism, and all the others that were available at that time. Even a bit of Lao Tzu is in it. So this makes that all those who proclaim the Bible as God's word, they are completely wrong, and they lack an incredible hunger and thirst for higher spiritual truths, and they take everything that is in the Bible as for granted, and so must it be true because he said it, and so must it be true. Which is of course not. And not everything that is in the Old Testament that is described to God is really coming from God. So this whole idea of work out your own salvation comes directly from the son of Gautama, Siddhartha. When proclaimed at its best, Gautama's gospel of universal salvation, free from sacrifice, torture, ritual, and priests, was a revolutionary and amazing doctrine for its time. And unfortunately, that Gautama, Siddhartha, did not understand the personal aspect, God as a personal God. If he would have mixed the individual and God together, then he would have done a great job. And it came surprisingly near to being a revival of the Salem gospel. It brought succor to millions of despairing souls, and notwithstanding its grotesque perversion during later centuries, its grotesque perversions during later centuries, which means what I've said before, the Buddhist teachings are not the teachings of Gautama Siddhartha anymore. They got so distorted, twisted, altered. A lot of things have been added to it. A lot of good things have been taken out. And I think that it's the same with Lao Tse, or some say Lao Tzu. The same if there have been some that were able to contain some of the old teachings, the original teachings, yeah, if they have been passed on to those people who were in the know and who who did their uttermost best to preserve something of the old teachings. If you are dealing with, let's say, yeah, a grandson of such a person, then the chances are there that you are more in connection with the originality of a teaching. Siddhartha taught far more truth than has survived in the modern cults bearing his name. Again, Siddhartha taught far more truth than has survived in the modern cults bearing his name. And it's the same with Christianity. Christianity of today has nothing to do with Jesus, but it is bearing his name, Christ. But it doesn't say it is of Christ completely, because there is a lot of distortions going on in Christianity too. And most of Christianity is unfortunately based on the teachings of Paul of Tarsus. So actually you can say that we are dealing with Paulianity instead of Christianity, the teachings of Christ. Modern Buddhism is no more the teachings of Gautama Siddhartha. Then is Christianity the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So they are stating it here. And then point 8, the Buddhist faith. To become a Buddhist, one merely made public profession of the faith by reciting the refuge. I take my refuge in the Buddha. I take my refuge in the doctrine. I take my refuge in the brotherhood. You also can say, I take my refuge in the paradise. Father, I take my refuge in the teachings of Christ. Michael, whom we better know as Jesus of Nazareth, and I take my refuge in the brotherhood. Amen. Buddhism took origin in a historic person, not in a myth. Gautama's followers called him Sasta, meaning master or teacher. Oh yeah, while he made no superhuman claims for either himself or his teachings, his disciples early began to call him the Enlightened One. So here we can see how humanity is so fond of setting people on a pedestal. It was not done by himself, it's always done by followers, disciples themselves, that place a teacher on a pedestal, and on a high pedestal. Humanity, I don't know what humanity has with placing others that are seemingly a bit more above them, to place them on a high pedestal. And it's not only done with so-called gurus and whatsoever, but it's also done with, better said, humans do this toward each other themselves too. If they come in contact with a fellow brother, sister, in which they think and have the idea that this person is functioning on a higher level of understanding things, then that person is being placed on a pedestal too. And this has happened to me several times in my life, and I constantly say to these persons, I am just as you are, learning. I am in the learning. I am following a journey, just as you are. I am walking a journey towards paradise, just hopefully as you are doing. I am not worth it to be placed on a pedestal at all, but probably people feel something in me, or I don't know what it is, and they do this to me, and I truly dislike it. I truly do. It's gruesome, actually. And as soon as I then do things that are not keeping up this image of me that they have placed on a pedestal, then all of a sudden I am this, I am that, and whatever. But it's their mistake in the first place to place me on a pedestal and have creating an image about me that is so unrealistic, and then something happens and their whole imagery that they created around me falls into pieces, and then all of a sudden I am this and I'm that. Well, that happens and has happened with the greatest teachers too. And then the humanity gets disappointed in the person that they have placed on the pedestal, no matter if it's Buddha, no matter if it's Lao Tse, no matter if it's their neighbor or another fellow brother or sister. Doesn't matter. As soon as humans are placing others on a pedestal, making a whole image around that person because they feel something, or I don't know, recognize something that is of which they think is standing far above them, and place them on a pedestal, that's the most stupidest thing to do. Never do that. Never. We all are on a journey in learning what it means to be a mortal that lives a mortal life. We all are in a journey in experiencing who God is and finding God, understanding God. We all are in this journey. No one can stand above one another. But that's what people do. As soon as they feel that they have someone in front of them that is, in their eyes and opinion, seemingly a bit better than they are, then that person will be placed on a pedestal. And as soon as that person is doing something that is, in their opinion, too much ordinary, then all of a sudden that person is being fallen off of the pedestal, and that person is this and whatever that they are yelling to that person whom they themselves have placed on a pedestal in the first place. Was not done by the person itself. So Buddhism took origin in a historic person, not in a myth. Gautama's followers called him Sasta. Here it goes again, followers, yeah, disciples. While he made no superhuman claims for either himself or his teachings, and so his followers started to see him as the enlightened one. And so this whole idea of an enlightened one that is circling around Buddha, so circling around Gautama Siddhartha, is still going on unto the day of today with the help of these with this new age that has used this to lure as many as people possible in distorted Buddhistic teachings. Later on, Sakyamuni Buddha, the original gospel of Gautama, was based on the Four Noble Truths. 1. The Noble Truths of Suffering. 2. The Origins of Suffering. 3. The Destruction of Suffering. And 4. The Way of Destruction of Suffering. Closely linked to the doctrine of suffering and the escape therefrom was the philosophy of the eightfold path: right views, aspirations, speech, conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and contemplation. It was not Gautama's intention to attempt to destroy all effort, desire, and affection in the escape from suffering. Rather was his teaching designed to picture to mortal man the futility of pinning all hope and aspirations entirely on temporal goals and material objectives. It was not so much that love one's fellows should be shunned as that the true believer should also look beyond the associations of this material world to the realities of the eternal future. So the moral commandments of Gautama's preachment were 5 in number. 1. You shall not kill. 2. You shall not steal. 3. You shall not be unchaste. 4. You shall not lie. And 5. You shall not drink any intoxicating liquors. There were several additional or secondary commandments whose observance was optional with believers. Siddhartha hardly believed in the immortality by human personality. His philosophy only provided for a sort of functional continuity. He never clearly defined what he meant to include in the doctrine of nirvana, the fact that it could theoretically be experienced during mortal existence. During mortal existence would indicate that it was not viewed as a state of complete annihilation. So a lot of things of Gautama's teachings have been misunderstood due to all the distortions that have been added to it, and a lot of things that have been taken out. The same with the Bible in actuality. And that what happened, you can say that the Bible mirrors actually exactly what has happened with all these old teachings. And then 9, the spread of Buddhism. Buddhism prospered because it offered salvation through belief in the Buddha, in the enlightened one. It was more representative of the Melchizedek truths than any other religious system, to be found throughout Eastern Asia. But Buddhism did not become widespread as a religion until it was espoused in self-protection by the low-caste monarch Asoka, who, next to Akhenaton in Egypt, was one of the most remarkable civil rulers between Melchizedek and Michael. Between the period of Melchizedek and Michael, and the coming of Michael. Asoka built a great Indian empire through the propaganda of his Buddhist missionaries. During a period of 25 years, he trained and sent forth more than 17,000 missionaries to the farthest frontiers of all the known world. In one generation, he made Buddhism the dominant religion of one half the world. It soon became established in Tibet, Kashmir, Salem, Burma, Java, Siam, Korea, China, and Japan. Generally speaking, it was a religion vastly superior to those which it supplanted or upstepped. The spread of Buddhism from its homeland in India to all of Asia is one of the thrilling stories of the spiritual devotion and missionary persistence of sincere religionists. The teachers of Gautama's gospel not only traversed the perils of the overland caravan routes, but faced the dangers of the China seas as they pursued their mission over the Asiatic continent. Bringing to all peoples the message of their faith, but this Buddhism was no longer the simple doctrine of Gautama. It was the miraculized gospel which made him a god. So people are creating from ordinary people a god, while these people themselves never wanted this to happen. And with that, they added all sorts of fantasy miracles to it to make this person even more godlike and so on. So there is the whole basis and root of all these so-called miracles and wonders. The Bible is also part of this. It's also a book in which people are reading of all sorts of miracles, which have in actuality not all of them took ever place. But these miracles have been written in the Bible because humanity loves miracles. And humanity only can believe in God if they see miracles. And if they read stories in which they can read about miracles. Humanity is addicted to miracles, you can say. And the farther Buddhism spread from its highland home in India, the more unlike the teachings of Gautama it became, and the more like the religions it supplanted it grew to be. Buddhism in later stage was much affected by Taoism in China, Shinto in Japan, and Christianity in Tibet. After 1,000 years in India, Buddhism simply withered and expired. It became Brahmanized and later abjectly surrendered to Islam, while throughout much of the rest of the Orient it degenerated into a ritual which Gautama Siddhartha would never have recognized. So people create all these traditions and things that you read then in these so-called ancient teachings, all these miracles and rituals and ceremonies are all man-created, ideas. In the South, the fundamentalist stereotype of the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama persisted in Ceylon, Burma, and the Indo-China Peninsula. This is the Hinayana division of Buddhism. Which clings to the early or a-social doctrine. But even before the collapse in India, the Chinese and North Indian groups of Gautama's followers had begun the development of the Mahayana teaching of the Great Road to Salvation. In contrast with the purists of the South who held to the Hinayana. So you also have in Buddhism Puritans, and these Puritans were actually clinging and holding themselves to the Hinayana or the lesser road. And these Mahayanists castes loose from the social limitations inherent in the Buddhism doctrine or Buddhist doctrine, and ever since has this northern division of Buddhism continued to evolve in China and Japan. Buddhism is a living, growing religion today because it succeeds in conserving many of the highest moral values of its adherents. It promotes calmness and self-control, augments serenity and happiness, and does much to prevent sorrow and mourning. Those who believe this philosophy live better lives than many who do not. And then point 10, religion in Tibet. In Tibet may be found the strangest association of the Melchizedek teachings combined with Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Christianity. When the Buddhist missionaries entered Tibet, they countered a state of primitive savagery, very similar to that which the early Christian missionaries found among the northern tribes of Europe. Well, these simple-minded Tibetans would not wholly give up their ancient magic and charms. Examination of the religious ceremonials of present-day Tibetan rituals reveals an overgrown brotherhood of priests with shaven heads who practice and elaborate ritual embracing bells, chants, incense, processionals, rosaries, images, charms, pictures, holy water, gorgeous vestments, and elaborate choirs. They have rigid dogmas and crystallized creeds, mystic rites, and special fasts. Their hierarchy embraces monks, nuns, abbots, and the Grand Lama. They pray to angels, saints, and a Holy Mother. Holy Mother, this concept is coming from the worshipping of the Mother of Jesus. No, this Holy Mother worship comes in actuality from the root is laid in the worship of Eve, and later this worship in Eve turned into the worship of the Mother of Jesus, and so that's where the so-called Mary and Holy Mary and so forth comes from. But in actuality, the whole Holy Mother cult, its first root was laid in worshipping Eve. And yeah, unfortunately, Eve unfortunately there have been a lot of pictures of Eve, so they could do this, and then later on Eve came out of picture or out of picture, and then it turned into the worship of the Mother of Jesus. So there comes the whole Mary worship from, and it all goes back to this Holy Mother idea and worship and concept. And these so-called gods, they practice confessions, which is you can really read here that the Tibetans are a cocktail. The religion of the Tibetans is a cocktail from all religions in one. They practice confessions and believe in purgatory. Their monasteries are extensive and their cathedrals magnificent. They keep up an endless repetition of sacred rituals and believe that such ceremonials bestow salvation. Prayers are fastened to a wheel, and with its turning they believe the petitions become efficacious. Among no other people of modern times can be found the observance of so much from so many religions, and it is inevitable that such a cumulative liturgy would become inordinately cumbersome and intolerably burdensome. The Tibetans have something of all the leading world religions, except the simple living teachings of the Jesusonian gospel: sonship with God, brotherhood with men, and ever-ascending citizenship in the eternal universe. And then 11, the Buddhist philosophy. While in some respects it is unfortunate that Buddhism was not carried to the world until after Gautama's followers had so perverted, here it's being stated, perverted the traditions and teachings of the cult as to make him a divine being. which he never promoted himself to be. Nonetheless, this myth of his human life, embellished as it was with a multitude of miracles. What happened to Gautama Siddhartha exactly happened with Jesus. This Paul of Tarsus guy did the same. He made a Jesus image that is not what Jesus and whom Jesus really was. But he did this because he never ever has met Jesus in himself in real life. So humanity has added a lot of miracles and wonders to Jesus, while Jesus actually did one miracle or wonder in his whole lifetime, and maybe two, but the rest was done with by other beings, such as seraphims or midwayers or life carriers, and were done actually because the thought adjuster gave the command to these beings, to these celestials, to perform such a miracle or wonder. Because God the Father wanted himself to heal a certain amount of people. Human life is embellished as it was with a multitude of miracles, proved very appealing to the auditors of the Northern or Mahayana Gospel of Buddhism. Some of Gautama's later followers taught that Sakyamuni Buddha's spirit returned periodically to earth as a living Buddha. Here we can read already the same saying as Jesus did. So Jesus used the already existing ideas and beliefs and concepts and conceptual framework that humans already got used to it, but he added something to it and made his own turn in it. And also Jesus said that he would one day return as soon as he himself seems fit to come back to earth again. It's not on us, the people, to command or demand from Jesus to come back. It is on Christ Michael, Jesus of Nazareth himself, to decide when he finds it the right moment to come back. People forget that that 1,000 years, our time is just one day in universal time. So as a matter of fact, Jesus just left the house 2 days ago. So in Buddhism, they also saw this, and they also made people believe that eventually the spirit of Gautama Siddhartha would return. Periodically as a living Buddha, thus opening the way for an indefinite perpetuation of Buddha images, temples, rituals, and imposter, between quotation mark, living Buddhas. So by doing this and by saying this, and this is exactly what we see happening also with Jesus, because of the fact that people came to know that Jesus comes back, this has opened indeed the path for the endless commercialized pictures, t-shirts with Jesus on it, and whatsoever that humanity has come up with, and in actuality has nothing to do with Jesus at all. And what happens now at the moment in the world is also a very questionable thing. There are now a lot of people who find it their duty to enforce Jesus onto others now, which doesn't work, and you only create something which is called the opposite, and brings more distance between what I want to say. Yeah, if you start to enforce Jesus upon others and his existence upon others, you create an contra effect. People then will walk away from Jesus instead of coming to Jesus. Well, the great advance made in Buddhist philosophy consisted in its comprehension of the relativity of all truth through the mechanisms of this hypothesis. Buddhists have been able to reconcile and correlate the divergencies within their own religious scriptures, as well as the difference between their own and many others. It was taught that the small truth was for little minds, the large truth for great minds. This philosophy also held that the Buddha nature resided in all men, that man through his own endeavors could attain to the realization of this inner divinity. And this teaching is one of the clearest presentations of the truth of the indwelling adjusters ever to be made by a Urantian religion. Nevertheless, there were certain broad levels which the minds of the Buddhists reached, tarried upon, and passed through on their way to the envisioning of the primal source of universes. And if you want to, if you are a person that is very onto wanting to know the real name of God, then you can say this is actually then what you could say name for God, primal source of universes. And the first one is the Gautama legend. The second is the many Buddhas. It was reasoned that if Gautama had come to the peoples of India, then in the remote past and in the remote future the races of mankind must have been and undoubtedly would be blessed with other teachers of truth. 3. The absolute Buddha. By the time the number of Buddhas was approaching infinity, it became necessary for the minds of those days to reunify this unwieldy concept. Accordingly, it began to be taught that all Buddhas were but the manifestation of some higher essence, some eternal one, of infinite and unqualified existence, some absolute source of reality. And that is another name for God, because God is also known as God the Absolute and God the Ultimate and God the Almighty One. But in actuality, what is God? God is the primal source or primal cause. So you can also speak to the primal cause, or say primal source, whatever you like to call the creator of light and life. He's not a creator that says, oh, you need to call me such and such, and that is the only way and only names. No, that is all a man-created idea, and people whom are falling for these Hebrew root messianic sacred name movements, in which the false teachers and very confused brothers and sisters are trying to convince a horde of people that the name of God is Yahuwah and the name of Jesus is Yahusha. That is all man created and absolutely of no, it doesn't make any sense at all. In the first case, it is not coming from God. It is all coming from man. It is an illusion and deception created by man himself to lure as many as possible of God's children into new levels of illusion and deception. Don't fall for it. I did too, but thankfully God took me out right on time and showed me that it is really a man-created idea and concept. Absolute source of... okay, I continue. Accordingly, it began to be taught that all Buddhas were but the manifestation of some higher essence, some eternal one of infinite and unqualified existence, some absolute source of all reality. From here on, the deity concept of Buddhism in its highest form becomes divorced from the human person of Gautama Siddhartha and casts off from the anthropomorphic limitations which have held it in leash. This final conception of the Buddha eternal can well be identified as the absolute, sometimes even as the infinite I am. At times the absolute was even thought of as contained within the infinite I am, but these speculations were chill comfort to the hungry multitudes who crave to hear words of promise, to hear the simple gospel of Salem, that living faith in the one true living God, the creator of light and life, who is the primal cause, who is the first source and center, would assure divine favor and eternal survival. And then the last point, point 12, the God concept of Buddhism. The great weakness in the cosmology of Buddhism was twofold: its contamination with many of the superstitions of India and China, and its sublimation of Gautama. First as the enlightened one, and then as the eternal Buddha. Just as Christianity has suffered from the absorption of much erroneous human philosophy, so thus Buddhism bare its human birthmark too. But the teachings of Gautama have continued to evolve during the past 2.5 millenniums. The concept of Buddha to an enlightened Buddhist is no more the human personality of Gautama. So The concept of Buddha to an enlightened Buddhist is no more the human personality of Gautama than the concept of Jehovah is identical with the spirit demon of Horeb. And Jehovah is also Yahweh. So who was Yahweh? Yahweh was a demon of Horeb. Now we get another understanding of whom Yahweh is, and I truly have the idea that the modern name is now Yahuwah, and this demon of Horeb has all of a sudden has created a son, and that is Yahusha. I came to notice that those people who use these names eventually, and I have seen this in myself and around myself too, all of a sudden I started to experience weird things which were very dark and very unpleasant when I started to use these names, and unfortunately God took me out of it and said to me, don't use these names anymore, and I will show you why. And he later on showed me this. So and I truly have the idea that this Hebrew root Messianic sacred name movements are trying to utter their idea and image and picture and understanding of how they still see the Messiah. So it's their imaginary Messiah idea, concept, as they also had in the time of Jesus and long before Michael came to Urantia. To an enlightened Christian, so the concept of Buddha to an enlightened Buddhist is no more than the human personality of Gautama. Then the concept of Jehovah is identical with the spirit of demon of Horeb, the spirit demon of Horeb, to an enlightened Christian. Paucity of terminology together with the sentimental retention of olden nomenclature is often provocative of the failure to understand the true significance of the evolution of religious concepts. So gradually the concept of God, as contrasted with the absolute, began to appear in Buddhism. Its sources are back in the early days of this differentiation of the followers of the lesser road and the greater road. It was among the later division of Buddhism that the dual conception of God and the absolute finally matured. Step by step, century by century, the God concept has evolved until, while the teachings of Ryonin, Honen, Shonin, and Shinran in Japan, this concept finally came to fruit in the belief in Amida Buddha. Okay, among these believers, it is taught that the soul, upon experiencing death, may elect to enjoy a sojourn in paradise prior to entering nirvana. And I think that the nirvana, it says prior to entering nirvana, and nirvana is in actuality paradise, the ultimate of existence. It is proclaimed that this new salvation is attained by faith in the divine mercies and loving care of Amida, God of the paradise in the West. in their philosophy. The Amidists hold to an infinite reality which is beyond all finite mortal comprehension. In their religion, they cling to faith in the all-merciful Amida. Whoso loves the world that he will not suffer one mortal who calls on his name in true faith and with a pure heart to fail in the attainment of the supernal happiness of paradise. Well, this is exactly what we also read in the Bible, so we can say here another influence being seen in the Bible that is actually coming and stemming from a later type of Buddhism. The great strength of Buddhism is that its adherents are free to choose truth from all religions. Such freedom of choice has seldom characterized a Urantian faith. In this respect, the Shin sect of Japan has become one of the most progressive religious groups in the world. It has revived the ancient missionary spirit of Gautama's followers and has begun to send teachers to other peoples. This willingness to appropriate truth from any and all sources is indeed a commendable tendency to appear among religious believers during the first half of the 20th century after Christ. Buddhism itself is undergoing a 20th century renaissance through contact with Christianity. The social aspects of Buddhism have been greatly enhanced. The desire to learn has been rekindled in the hearts of the monk, priests of the Brotherhood, and the spread of education throughout this faith will be certainly provocative of new advances in religious evolution. At the time of this writing, much of Asia rests its hope in Buddhism. Will this noble faith that has so valiantly carried on through the dark ages of the past once again receive the truth of expanded cosmic realities, even as the disciples of the great teacher in India once listened to his proclamation of new truth? Will this ancient faith respond once more to the invigorating stimulus of the presentation of new concepts of God and the Absolute for which it has so long searched? All Urantia is awaiting for the proclamation of the ennobling message of Michael, unencumbered by the accumulated doctrines and dogmas of 19 centuries of contact with the religions of evolutionary origin. The hour is striking for presenting to Buddhism, to Christianity, to Hinduism, even to the peoples of all faiths, not the gospel about Jesus, but the living spiritual reality of the gospel of Jesus. And with this said, I have come to the end of reading paper 94, and all the information has been presented to us by a Melchizedek of Nebadon. And thank you so much, Melchizedek of Nebadon, for giving us this information. And to all of you who have listened to this audio video, thank you for listening. And I wish you all a beautiful, inspirational, loving day, and that all the things that you are doing are in alignment with the will of the Heavenly Father, the Paradise Father, or God. God bless you.